Hey everyone, so in this lecture we're going to be looking at some grafting techniques. So before we get into the techniques, I want to talk about some general requirements or considerations, right? And these are going to be for all of the techniques that we talk about. So we'll say general requirements. Right, so when we're grafting, there's a couple things that we want to be aware of or that we want to try and do. So the first thing that we need to make sure is that we have compatible rootstock and scion wood. And so let's say compatibility of rootstock and scion. And if you remember from the last lecture, this really is based upon relatedness, genetic relatedness, right? So our cultivars that are the same species are generally going to be compatible. We can graft them. Sometimes we can graft different species that are in the same genera. Rarely we can graft genera that are in the same family, and that's about the extent of it, right? But if we are talking about cultivars, so different varieties of apples or peaches or tomatoes, generally they are going to be able to be grafted together. So that's first consideration. Second consideration, when we're grafting, one of the big goals, one of the big things that we're going to strive to do is make sure the vascular cambiums of both the rootstock and the scion are in direct contact. Now again, we talked about vascular cambium in the last lecture. It is the meristematic tissue, so that's the tissue that's actively producing new cells. And this tissue produces the vascular tissue, so the xylem and the phloem. And think of that as your arteries and veins. In our plants, the xylem tissue is transporting water upward from the roots to the rest of the plant, where our phloem is transporting sugars, essentially, throughout the entire plant. So without the vascular cambiums, you can't have this flow of nutrients and sugars, and our plants will die. So it's really important that when we are grafting that we line up these vascular cambiums, because that is essentially what is going to be produced with our graft union. When that graft union forms, we're going to start forming new vascular cambium, new xylem, new phloem tissue. So it's really important that in this initial part we try and line up these tissues as close as possible. So that's second consideration. Third consideration. All of this needs to be done at the appropriate physiological stage. And that is for both our rootstock and our scion. Usually, this means we're looking for, in our scions, our buds to be dormant. This is in our scions. Again, the scions, that's the top part of our graft. It's going to form the shoot system. So what this means, a lot of times we will take our scion wood in the winter from dormant plants, especially deciduous plants. We'll take it in the winter, and then we'll store it in cold temperatures, keep it moist, and then we can graft it on in early spring. So this is buds to be dormant. This is particularly with our deciduous species. For our herbaceous species, they can be grafted any time of year. Right. So we need to make sure our rootstock and our scion is compatible. When we're grafting, we want to put those vascular cambiums in direct contact with each other. we want to make sure that we're doing this at the appropriate physiological stage for our scion wood and our rootstock. Typically, especially with our deciduous species, we're taking that wood when it's dormant. For our herbaceous species, grafting can be done at any time of year. And then we also want to be sure, we want to prevent desiccation. And that's just a fancy word for drying out. Right? So we don't want our plants to dry out. When we graft, we are wounding them, and they are susceptible to drying out. So we want to try and prevent that. And we do that by applying different coverings. We can use wax, grafting wax. We will use a type of tape. I use parafilm. There's also something called buddy tape that we'll look at. So we want to essentially cover these wounds, seal them in so our plants aren't going to lose water. And then lastly, another kind of general consideration is just proper care. So after you graft your plants, give basic proper care, like water. Sometimes your rootstock will start developing shoots that can overcrowd your scion wood, so you may need to prune them back, but just general care that you would for your other plants. So those are some general requirements that are going to apply to all of these grafting techniques. So with that said, now let's take a look at the actual techniques themselves. So we have got 3 main types of grafts. Right, and I have them, you see that table over there on the right. There are lots of different grafting techniques. We're not going to go into all of them, but I am going to highlight some of the main types and kind of give some examples. So of these main graft types, we have detached wood scion. Second main graft type, and that you see up there with that one. We have approach grafts. Approach grafts. And then third of our main, we have repair grafts. So those are our main graft types, and what I'm going to do is kind of give you some examples of each of these and explain what they are. So we're going to start with our detached wood scion here. So really what this means is that our scion wood is essentially a cutting. So it is not going to be, it won't have a root system or further shoot system still attached. This is kind of commonly what you may think of when we think of grafting. And within our detached scion grafting, we have a couple, again, of main types of grafts. So we can have apical graftage, apical grafts. We can have side grafts. We can have bark grafts. And then root grafts. So this sounds like a lot of different types of grafts. There are, again, we're not going to go into all of them, but I kind of just want to get you familiar with the idea of these types of grafts. Right? So when we are talking about our apical grafts, we are talking about the top of the plant. So what's happening is with our apical grafts, we are inserting or grafting the scion to top of rootstock. Alright, so we have, we'll draw it up here, we have our rootstock here. We're going to graft, and here's our scion, piece of scion wood. We're going to graft that onto the top of our rootstock. Easy, right? With our side grafts, we are, again, grafting the scion to the side of rootstock. So if we're looking at side grafts, here is our rootstock right here. We are going to graft our scion wood instead of the top. We're going to graft it to the side. Right? Easy. Bark grafts, we are placing the scion between the bark and wood of rootstock. So I'll show you examples of that. And then with our root grafts, these are our rootstock. Is actual roots or root pieces, right? So we will, with our root grafts, instead of having a rootstock that has roots and then a little bit of stem, our root grafts, we're actually using just a piece of root and grafting onto that root. Okay, so those are the main types of detached scion grafting, and what I'm going to do now is give you just a couple examples of each. So if you give me a second. Okay, so let's start with our apical grafts. And our first one that we're going to look at is the whip and tongue. So we're going to look at this one right here. So with our whip and tongue graft, I'm going to try and draw these out. So we have our rootstock, all our roots, and we'll have our piece of scion wood right here. So with this type of graft, what you're doing is you are making a angled cut on your rootstock, like so. And then, so you make an angled cut, and then a third of the way down, you make another cut. So you go a third of the way down, and you make another cut inward like that. And then you do the opposite on your scion. So you make an angled cut. Then again, a third of the way down, you make another just vertical cut. And what that does is it essentially makes what they refer to as tongues. And then when you're actually grafting these together, so we'll draw it over here. It kind of looks like that, and there's the little tongue piece, and then down. Again, sorry, not the best artist. It's actually pretty rough looking rootstock. So there's our rootstock, and we'll do our scion wood in a different color to make it nicer. So that's there, and then you'll have your scion like that. So essentially what I'm trying to show you is by creating those little tongues, by making your slant cuts and then going a third of the way in the vertical cuts, those tongues line up together. Right? They kind of line up together, and that makes a sturdier graft. It gives you a little more contact with that vascular cambium. It holds the graft in place better. So it's a popular type of graft. What you'll then do is wrap this in whatever type of binding material you have. I use parafilm, and then you can apply some wax to it as well to make it watertight. Alright, so that's the whip and tongue graft. My poor drawing of the whip and tongue graft. Next, I'm going to attempt to draw the saddle graft. So that's another type of apical graft. It should be a little bit easier to draw, thankfully. So you have your rootstock here. So this is going to be a saddle graft. So you got rootstock here. And what you're going to do with your rootstock is you are essentially going to make a blunt tip. That's the proper word. Right, so you're going to cut into your rootstock to make kind of a tip like that, right? And then in your scion wood, you're going to make more of a wedge shape. So you're going to cut into your scion to make a wedge shape, like so. And then they fit right on top of each other. Again, you do the same thing. You bind it with some sort of material. You can apply wax if you want as well. So I'm going to show you a video that I speed up, but it's me grafting our apple trees. It's something we would have done in lab. I used both the wedge and tongue, or whip and tongue, I'm sorry, and the saddle graft for those types of grafting. Okay, so here you see some rootstock, apple rootstock. It's a dwarfing variety. Those are the different cultivars. Each one's different. That's the scion wood. Those are the pots that they're going to go in. And in the next little video, what you're going to see is me planting first the rootstock and then grafting one of the scions onto a rootstock. Alright, so let's get back to the lecture. Again, we're looking at our apical graphs, and now we're going to move on to the cleft graph. Our cleft graph, again, is a common type graft used for top working, especially if you have rootstock and scion woods that are of different diameter. So with our cleft graph, we have our rootstock, say it's an established tree. We are going to split it in the middle. All right, we're going to make a cut into the middle. And then we have thinner diameter scion wood over here. And we are going to our scion wood, we're going to cut and make essentially a thin wedge. And so that would be, so if this was your whole scion, you're cutting into here to make this thin wedge. It's actually probably be more like that. Again, not to scale. So we'll go down here. So this is our rootstock, and we have a wedge that we cut into the middle. And then into that wedge, we add our scion wood. So we can have one right here, and then another that goes right in here. And then you seal this whole thing up with wax. So again, this is a common type of graft for top working, and it's where we have different diameter rootstock and scion wood. Okay, those are all the apical grafts that I want you guys to be aware of. Next, we are going to take a look at side grafts. Just like our whip and tongue, we could have a side tongue graft, which you see right here. So it's a similar idea. You have your rootstock, and you're going to make an incision in your rootstock. And then within that incision, you're going to make another, about a third of the way down, you're going to make another incision to create that tongue, right? So if we're looking on the side, it's going to look something like that. Right? and then you take your scion wood and you do the same thing with a cut, and then the tongue. So it's going to look like that. And then you graft your scion wood onto your rootstock. And this is a side tongue graft. And the idea, those tongues that you're creating are going to ideally increase your surface area of your vascular cambium touching each other and allow for a more secure graft. So that goes in there, those tongues slip in, this would come out like that. Okay, it's not the best drawing. So that's the side tongue graft. You can also do just a graft without that tongue, just like a side stub graft. So you go in, add an angle, right, you make your incision here, add an angle, and then you just take your scion, make it an angle cut, and it goes right on in there. So you can do it without the tongue, and that's more of a side stub graft. Alright, so if we look at a bark graft, the example we'll look at is just the basic one, kind of similar to your cleft graph. You have, again, a piece of rootstock with a pretty large diameter. And what you're going to do is make, essentially you're making incisions and freeing up the space between the bark and the wood. So that wood tissue is actually xylem, and the bark, the inner part of the bark, is phloem. So you're freeing up that area right by our vascular cambium that's between them. And then you insert, you make a nice angled cut on your scion, like so. This is not to scale. And you would insert that into your bark pieces, or between the bark and the wood. And then this we cover in wax again, and we're using that wax, that grafting wax, to prevent desiccation. And the grafting wax also helps prevent attack from pathogens that may be able to enter the tree through the wound that you're making. Okay, so that's a bark graft. And then for root grafts, really the techniques used in root grafting are the same as you might see with our apical grafts. The real only difference is that we're using a piece of root. So a lot of times you have your root piece down here, and you're going to do like a saddle graft. So you make that into the saddle shape, and you take your scion and you give it the opposite, like that, and you graft those right onto each other. Okay. So we won't do a separate thing for that, but that's a, we'll say, root graft. And it's a root graft because your rootstock is a root. Simple. All right. So direct or detached scion grafting was one main type. And the second main type that we're going to look at is approach grafting. With approach grafting, the big difference here is that scion and your rootstock are they are independent living plants while grafted, at least initially, right? So with our detached scion, we may have a rootstock, and then we take a piece of stem tissue that's going to be used as our scion wood, and we attach it to the top of our rootstock, we'll say. With our approach grafting, we have two plants, and we'll do these in different colors. So we have two plants that are living, right, independent of each other. And what we're going to do is we graft them together while they're still independent. And we'll say this one is the rootstock. Rootstock, and green is going to be our scion. So instead of taking a piece of this scion wood, we keep it attached as the whole plant. And then once that graft union forms, we cut the top of our rootstock and we cut the roots off of our scion wood. The end result is a plant that has the roots of our rootstock, and the top of our scion, right? So we maintain these trees, we maintain their shoot system and their root system until the graft union forms, and then we remove the either roots if we're talking about scion wood, or the shoot system if we're talking about the rootstock, and now we have our fully grafted plant. Right? So that's approach grafting. And just like with when we looked at detached scion woods, there's a couple different types of approach grafting, different techniques. I have them over here. Similar concepts. You know, you just make some cuttings into both to expose the inner tissue, that cambium tissue, graft that together. You can add the tongues in if you want, or you can do more of an inlay approach right there. So all different techniques. Again, we don't have to go too deep into it. Just want you to be aware of this type of grafting as well. And then lastly, we're going to look at repair grafting. So this is done, as the name suggests, to repair damaged roots or trunk typically of mature trees or of large trees. So we have over here in-arching. So there's different types. We have in-arching, and that is, oh, come on. Oh, there we go. In-arching, and that is really used to repair roots. And then we have bridge grafting. And that is... Now you're slowing down on me, computer. And that is to... repair. Come on. Come on, you can do it. That's to repair the trunk. So, if you look up on the top figure up there, that is an example of in-arching. What you do is you have your mature tree that maybe the roots got damaged from some way. You will plant or take smaller, younger saplings and plant them next to that tree so they have their own root system, healthy root system, and then you graft them onto the mature tree. And in this way, they form a new composite tree that has the nice, healthy roots of those young saplings. Right? Make sense? With bridging, that is where we got some of the trunk tissue was damaged. So you're going to remove the outer bark and that tissue was damaged. And then between that damaged tissue, remove all the damaged tissue, and then you graft scion wood in between it to form this type of bridge of healthy wood that is now going to grow and take the place of the damaged wood. Right? Pretty simple concept. So those are different types of repair grafting that you can do. I kind of sped through that a little quickly, but my computer's starting to mess up. Last thing that I want you guys to be aware of are the tools that we typically use for grafting. So obviously, we're going to need a knife. Right, now they make special grafting knives, and what is important about our grafting knives is that they have a single beveled edge. So what that means is, like, say your typical hunting knife or kitchen knife comes to the edge, comes to a point. Please work. Like that. Right, so this is your kitchen knife. Your grafting knife has only a single edge on the side. So it is like that, although it's a much greater angle on that edge. Right, so there's one flat edge. And the knives are like that because they give you better control when grafting and making certain cuts. You have to be aware that it has one flat edge and one cut edge. A lot of times this is unfortunate for you left-handed folks, such as myself, because a lot of these are edged in a way to make it easier to cut for right-handers. So something to be aware of. So besides your knife, you are also going to need some sort of material that is going to allow you to bind your graft, or you bind your wood together, or your scion wood. So a tying or wrapping. Okay. All right. Listen, my computer is starting to mess up, so I'm just going to talk. So you'll need some tying or some wrapping material. If you're on a budget, if you don't have stuff, you can make do with duct tape or electrical tape. Better things, they actually make a grafting tape. You can use parafilm, which I use. There's a thing called buddy tape, which is parafilm-like, that you can also use. If you are doing more herbaceous plants like grafting tomatoes, they make clips that make this process really easy. You can just clip them right on. And then I also talked about grafting wax. That will hold your graft union together, but it's more used to keep it, to prevent that drying out, right? Prevent desiccation, and to prevent pathogens from moving in. So that's it. That's the end of the lecture. Hope you guys enjoyed.